Hello, and welcome to another episode of League, Lore, and More. Last time, we started our series on the ancient civilization known as Shurima and introduced ourselves to the long-lost Emperor Azir as he returns from myth and legend to lead the once mighty Shuriman people. Today, we will be continuing with Azir's story and making sense of what he means to Shurima's people and its legacy. If you do enjoy the content, please download, like, share, and whatever other method you might have to show your support for the podcast. You can find these podcasts uploaded to YouTube at my channel, Funky Odor. You can find me on Twitter at OdorFunky. And if you want to absorb more League of Legends content, please check out my stream on twitch.tv/thatfunkyodor. Thank you all for the support and enjoy.
Like the sun, Shurima always rises.
Azir was an emperor of Shurima who sought to become one of the powerful ascended beings. As we learned last week when Azir was speaking to Kari, he turned a blind eye to the workings of Xerath, who was plotting against Azir. This hubris resulted in Azir's ascension ceremony being disrupted and Azir himself dying. As Kari came to realize, Azir has been reborn with great power and intends to restore Shurima to its former greatness. Shurima itself sprawled across large portions of the world, and the Emperor, Azir's father at the time, ruled mightily and conquered lands with the aid of mighty ascended warriors at the helm of his armies. Champions like Nasus and Renekton were these ascended warriors that would lead these armies into battle and win the battles just by appearing on the battlefield. They wouldn't even have had to engage in combat with anybody. The enemies would just turn and run as soon as they showed up. This, however, was not always meant to be the path for Azir. The youngest and least favored son of the Emperor, Azir was never destined for greatness. With so many siblings ahead of him, he would never be emperor. Most likely, he would take up a position in the priesthood or as governor of some backwater province. He was a slender, studious boy who spent more time perusing the texts collected in the great library of Nasus than training to fight under the stern tutelage of the ascended hero Renekton. That was an excerpt from Azir's biography found on the League of Legends Universe website. So it might also seem like Nasus wasn't doing a ton of the warmongering that Renekton would be, which lines up with their character personalities, which we will get to in the coming weeks. During his time studying and reading is when he would meet the boy Xerath. This is not the boy's original name, but one given to him by Azir, meaning one who shares. In Shurima, though, slaves didn't have names other than what their masters and their owners gave them. So Azir giving the boy a name was a grave sin and punishable should anybody find out. Since he wasn't actually his slave either. I'm sure maybe it wasn't that punishable since he was an emperor's son, but since he was one of the emperor's sons that the emperor didn't care for, then maybe he would have gotten punished for it. As with all stories, however, of somebody being many places removed in the line of succession, there needs to be some catastrophic event in which the older siblings all happen to die. The story does not deviate from that tradition, as Azir's brothers all die in an ambush while the emperor and his family are traveling across their empire, and once a year doing a tour of all the lands that are under the dominion of Shurima and its emperor, and they get ambushed by enemies, and Azir is the only surviving son. The Emperor survives. Even with Azir being his only heir, though, the Emperor doesn't really care for him. And part of that has to do with several of his children just dying in front of him. I'm assuming that would have something to do with it. And also with Azir showing no qualities that the Emperor wants to see in him. This is very reminiscent of the relationship between Denethor in Lord of the Rings with his sons Boromir and Faramir. And since we like to make analogies on this podcast and relate to things that people are more familiar with to help them better understand the dynamic in Runeterra and how and then they can, relate that to things that they are familiar with, like Lord of the Rings. So Denethor with his sons Boromir and Faramir. Denethor being the steward of Gondor, which means caretaker. He is in charge of Gondor. He's not the king, though, because he's not of the line of the kings, which is thought to have been ended, even though Aragorn is the true king and eventually returns and takes the throne once they defeat Sauron. That part is is not important. So Denethor has his two sons, Boromir and Faramir. Boromir gets all the praise and all the attention for being an amazing soldier and leader of men. Faramir prefers to study, read, learn, and has a friendship with Gandalf, who they call Mithrandir. And Denethor doesn't care for Gandalf much, and probably also fails to realize that Faramir takes to Gandalf in studying more because of the lack of attention that Denethor gives to him, which results in a vicious cycle that compounds upon itself until the relationship is completely broken, to the point that you send your only remaining son, Faramir, into certain death as you ask him to retake Osgiliath that just got ran over with orcs with like a couple hundred men on horseback. Then, before you know it, you're telling your guards to bring wood and oil as you intend to burn yourself and your son, who is clinging to life by a thread, as your city gets razed to the ground by 100,000 orcs, and not just orcs, but men too from the east and Haradrim from the south riding Mumakil, and corsairs from Umbar pillaging your coastline. That is kind of what the situation is with Azir. It's kind of scary how similar they are. Now, there's like a few minor details here and there where Denethor's story doesn't quite line up. You know, Azir's father didn't attempt to die with him in a funeral pyre as their capital got razed and their citizens got raped and pillaged. But I think there's a lot of similarities there. Azir's father and Denethor's mindset was that they both wished that the other boy or boys had survived and that Azir/Faramir had died. We literally see the dialogue in the movies. I'm not sure if it's exactly like that in the books, The Lord of the Rings, but Faramir asks, "You would wish that Boromir had lived and that I had taken his place?" And Denethor says, "Yeah." He says, "Yeah, I do. I wish that." And then he goes and, he's like, "Bye, like go retake Osgiliath that you just lost." And Faramir's like, "I'm going to do it to make you proud. And I know that it's going to kill me." And then Denethor eats tomatoes, and he like makes me never want to eat tomatoes again because he just eats them so disgustingly. And I don't know why that had to be in the movie, but it was in the movie, and I know that I'm on a tangent right now. But cut that out, Peter Jackson, director. I don't need to see tomato juice flying out of this dude's mouth when he bites into a little tiny cherry tomato or whatever they were, so disgustingly, while a hobbit sings the saddest song ever. Meanwhile, we're seeing the footage of Faramir riding out to retake the city he just lost. And then you see, 1,000 orcs line up bows and arrows and just kill everybody. Faramir luckily survives, which leads to the whole fire burning him and Denethor to death. It's just a wild thing. And so, yeah, kind of what we have here, except Azir's father kind of just ignores him completely. So now, though, with this whole succession story, the emperor needs to also die. And the emperor's wife, he was trying to have another son because he really just doesn't like Azir. So if he had another son, he would name him, his heir. But the emperor himself died, and his wife died in a natural disaster that strikes Shurima. Azir is just then thrust into the role of emperor, ready or not. He proved rather quickly that he was up to the task, instituting slave reforms, expanding borders, and creating just a greater Shurima. His vision for the slaves was one that ended in their complete freedom. Unfortunately, though, with the way politics functions, Azir needs to keep these plans secret. He even kept them from Zerath, who is a slave, but he's also Azir's best friend. He thinks of him as a brother, especially now with Azir having no brothers. After being convinced by Zerath that he, Azir, needed to become ascended in order to truly be a great emperor, Azir had the preparations made for an ascension ritual to be conducted for him. Upon reaching the altar underneath the sun disk, Azir freed the slaves and told Zerath that he was making him his lawful brother. Unbeknownst, however, to Azir, Zerath had been increasingly frustrated with being a slave, and even this royal decree by Azir was too little too late. As the ascension progress was getting underway, Zerath pushed Azir out of the light and took his place. So they're up on this dais, on this altar. Azir he's up there, he's having this energy come down upon him that's going to transform him. Azir shoves him out of the way and is the one receiving this powerful godlike energy. Since the energy being channeled was earmarked, though, for Azir, the ritual rebelled and the energy exploded across the city, leveling it, just evaporating the citizens, the buildings. Azir was absorbed into nothingness, and Shurima suffered the same fate as its emperor. Now I'm going to read a little excerpt from the Realms of Runeterra companion guide. After Azir's passing, Shurima became a very different place. The southern deserts of Khalik and blighted Acacia began to encroach upon the once verdant landscape, forcing the population to migrate widely and often in search of water. Shurima's population declined sharply year after year. Nomadic life was hard and often very short. There were still many wonders out there, certainly, but fewer and fewer Shurimans left to behold them. Trade and travel became a way of life. The old nations of the empire were gone, with everything north of the river now swallowed up by the treacherous deserts of the Great Sai. It fell to the nomad caravans to establish and maintain overland routes between the scattered settlements. Also, as explorers from distant lands began to seek Shurima's lost wealth, there were many Shurimans who were only too happy to act as guides in exchange for foreign gold. A number of ports and cities in the north were voluntarily assimilated into the ever-expanding empire of Noxus. The original inhabitants of these settlements live in relative peace with their Noxian counterparts, seeing the exchange of food and preferential trade as a price worth paying for military protection from raiders. Several millennia later, Azir had been reborn due to the blood of his last living descendant, the champion we know as Sivir. He has slowly returned to a physical form, and after his selfless act of saving this woman's life, Azir's ascension was taken to completion. He has become a mighty emperor, seeking to return Shurima to its former glory. The sands obey his every command, and he can raise an army from its depths with the motion of his hand. After raising his city from the sands of time below his feet, Azir set out to find Zerath and uproot his evil and treachery from Shurima. Now here's a story called Arisen and is found on the Riot Games League of Legends Universe website. Azir walked the gold-paved Emperor's Way. The immense statues of Shurima's earliest rulers, his ancestors, watched his progress. The soft, shadowy light of pre-dawn seeped through his city. The brightest stars still shone overhead, though they would soon be snuffed out by the rising sun. The night sky was not as Azir remembered it. The stars and the constellations were misaligned. Millennia had passed. With every step, Azir's heavy staff of office struck a lonely note, echoing through the capital's empty streets. When last he had walked this path, an honor guard of 10,000 elite warriors had marched in his wake, and the cheers of the crowd had shaken the city. It was to have been his moment of glory, yet it had been stolen from him. Now it was a city of ghosts. What had become of his people? With an imperious gesture, Azir commanded the sands beside the roadway to rise, creating living statues. This was a vision of the past, the echoes of Shurima given form. The sand figures looked forward, heads tilted toward the immense sun disk hanging above the dais of ascension, half a league ahead. It hung there still, declaring the glory and power of Azir's empire, though no one remained to see it. The daughter of Shurima who awakened him, she who bore his lineage, was gone. He sensed her out in the desert. Blood bound them together. As Azir walked the Emperor's way, the sand echoes of his people pointed up at the sun disk. Their joyful expressions turned to horror. Mouths opened wide in silent screams. They turned to run, stumbling and falling. Azir watched this all in despairing silence, bearing witness to the last moments of his people. They were obliterated by a wave of unseen energy, reduced to dust and cast to the winds. What had gone wrong with his ascension to unleash this catastrophe? Azir's focus narrowed. His march became more resolute. He reached the base of the stairs of ascension and began to climb, taking them 5 at a time. Only his most trusted soldiers, the priesthood, and those of the royal bloodline were allowed to step foot upon the stairs. Sand versions of these most favored subjects lined his path, faces upturned, grimacing and wailing in silence before they too were swept away by the winds. He ran, taking the steps faster than any man could, talons digging into the stonework, carving furrows where they caught. Sand figures rose and were then destroyed to either side of him as he climbed. He reached the top. Here he saw the final circle of onlookers, his closest aides, his advisors, the high priests, his family. Azir dropped to his knees. His family was before him, rendered in perfect, heartbreaking detail. His wife, heavy with child, his shy daughter clutching his wife's hand, his son standing tall on the brink of becoming a man. In horror, Azir saw their expressions change. Though he knew what was to come, he could not look away. His daughter hid her face in the folds of his wife's dress. His son reached for his sword, shouting in defiance. His wife, her eyes widened, sorrow and despair writ within. The unseen event blasted them to nothingness. It was too much, but no tears welled in Azir's eyes. His ascended form rendered that simple act of grief forever lost to him. With a heavy heart, he pushed himself to his feet. The question remained as to how his bloodline survived, for it most assuredly had. The final echo awaited. He advanced, halting one step below the dais, and watched as it all played out before him, reenacted in the sand. He saw himself, in his mortal form, rise up to the air beneath the sun disk, arms wide and back arched. He remembered this moment. The power coursed through him, infusing his being, filling him with its divine strength. A newcomer formed in the sand, his trusted bondsman, his magus, Zerath. His friend uttered a silent word. Azir watched himself shatter like glass, exploding into motes of sand. Zerath, breathed Azir. The traitor's expression was unknowable, but Azir could see nothing but the face of a murderer. Where did such hate come from? Azir had never been aware of it. The sand image of Zerath rose higher into the air as the sun disk's energies focused into his being. A cadre of elite guards rushed toward him, but they were all far too late. A brutal shockwave of sand flared out, disintegrating the final moment of Shurima. Azir stood alone among the dying echoes of his past. This is what killed his people. Azir turned away just as the first rays of the new dawn struck the sun disk overhead. He'd seen enough. The sand image of the transformed Zerath collapsed behind him. The dawn sun reflected blindingly off Azir's flawless golden armor. In that instant, he knew that the traitor still lived. He sensed the Magus's essence in the air that he breathed. Azir lifted a hand, and an army of his elite warriors rose from the sands at the base of the stairs of ascension. Zerath, he said, his voice tinged with rage, your crimes will not go unpunished. The end. So we see that Zerath still survived. Some of his Azir's descendants survived if they weren't, in the immediate vicinity of the blast. And then now Azir has also returned. So we have 2 characters now. Well, we kind of have 5 that we've been introduced to it, at least somewhat, with Zerath, first Azir, now Zerath, Nasus, Renekton, and Sivir. So next week we're going to continue with Zerath. We're going to explore this relationship more and the struggle between Zerath and Azir, kind of their battle, their rivalry, and see what became of Zerath after this botched ascension ritual. What does he look like now? Because as we learned in the past, if you fail an ascension ritual, you become like kind of this deformed creature. They're known as Bakai, and they usually the nice thing to do is to put them out of their misery, is what it says. If something like this happens, so it'll be interesting to find out what Zerath is up to, what basically he's been doing for a millennia, or if he's been dormant too, just like Azir has been until Azir was reborn. So yeah, Azir though is to Shurima what Ra was to ancient Egypt, or Zeus to ancient Greece. They're probably better examples, but I can't think of them, or I don't really kind of want to be like sacrilegious and compare a fictitious character to Jesus Christ. The point here is that the essence of Shurima seems tied to Azir. He is involved in its very makeup, and their existences are now forever intertwined with one another. This is similar to how every single situation in ancient Greece somehow ended up involving Zeus, most of the time with his pants down, or how God, through his son, Jesus Christ, is a part of the daily lives of those who believe in him and has a hand in guiding them through their journeys. Also has a hand in those who don't believe in him, that's what you believe, if you do believe in him. This characterization implies that Azir is somebody who is extremely important to not only Shurima, but the story of Runeterra as a whole. He has a large part to play. Although we probably won't be looking at things from Azir's point of view much more, especially after Shurima's story ends. His presence should be felt throughout our time in Shurima, but I'm sure that he will make his presence known in Runeterra going forward. That does it for this week's episode of League, Lore, and More. Thank you to everyone who listened this far or at all. I truly appreciate everyone for supporting the podcast. Please share the content if you enjoy it or have friends that you think would enjoy it. The more people that listen means the more people that are suggesting changes that can make the content better for everyone. You can find this on YouTube, search for Funky Odor. You can enjoy more of my content on twitch.tv/thatfunkyodor. And you can suggest things for the podcast to me on Twitter, as well as at funkyodorgaming@gmail.com. All of these links will be in the description. Join me again next week as we continue the story that Azir has started us on and look at his friend, brother, and eventual enemy, Zerath. Stay safe, wash your hands. See you next time. Bye, guys.